hard it is to have a peaceful protest.
Yes, it is. Good point. I hadn't heard that story. That's very good. Okay. Excuse me. We will go ahead and start. It's 10:31 and we have 24 people online. We will let them continue adding on. Welcome, everybody.
Welcome.
Good to see you here. Lots going on this week. Lots of stuff in the news. We are pleased to have Chris Stifler with us from the Colorado Fiscal Institute, senior economist, to talk to us really about the impact of this virus time on the Colorado state budget. So I know the hot topic of the week is the riots and the killing of George Floyd, but I think let's talk about that mostly next week. I will try to find a Black friend who can come on and talk with us a little about that, and we can cover all the stuff that's going on. It's been interesting, but I think it'd be much better if we wait a week and talk about all the things that are still unfolding. That would be helpful. I do want to mention to you that the Church of Resurrection in Kansas City had a complete sermon on the riot and the racial issue today. And if you want to tune in to that, look at core.org. Really, the pastor did an awesome job and interviewed the police chief and Black pastors there. It was an unusual, moving sermon. And if you have any interest, look at core.org and see that sermon. So any comments about the whole situation and things in the news before we get started with Chris? Everybody been watching it on TV?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
It's been covered pretty well. It's a sad situation. Well, we're up to 26 folks. Good turnout. So we have any announcements of things going on? I hope everybody saw our Reverend Mark's announcement this week that in-person services really won't start until fall, was the word he used. So he said July, the staff will come back into the church. August, maybe in-person services, but it sounds like they're not really looking at it till fall, which sounds like September to me. But we can always see how that will play out. So any other announcements? Okay, well, Chris Stifler has been with us before. Back when we used to meet in person in the church, Chris was with us, and he does a great job of explaining financial things in simple terms for us, and we really would like to know how this time is impacting the school funding and all the things that the legislature does, and really how it will hit things that we see in our pocketbooks. So Chris has been on NPR and CPR, and he knows his stuff. We are very lucky to have him talking today. So Chris, welcome. And you can hit your share screen anytime you're ready.
Okay.
Do your slides. I ask all of us to hold our questions until Chris is done in about 30 minutes, and then he'll leave 20, 30 minutes for us all to ask questions and talk about this. So thank you, Chris. Go ahead.
Yeah, I always enjoy coming and chatting with you. I think it's my third or fourth time. It's also nice to see so many faces. I've been teaching at DU through Zoom all spring, and most of my students go to that black screen where I can't really read faces or see reactions or see thumbs up or thumbs down, and mostly booing my bad jokes, thumbs down. So nice to see so many faces. Last time I talked to you, different world.
Steve, can you mute everyone?
Yes, I can do that. There we go. Okay, everybody's muted. So go ahead, Chris.
Unmute the speaker, please.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can see my slides.
Yep.
There we go. All right.
There we go. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, there's a lot of things we can talk about, whether it's the federal response to the COVID crisis with the CARES Act, whether it's what we're doing with the state budget, what's happening with our schools, what's happening in the fall with our elections. So I'm going to lay out probably 20 minutes of material, and then we can take the conversation whichever way you want to discuss. But the last time I was here, the unemployment rate was like about 3%. We had a budget surplus, and we were talking about fiscal and economic issues. Now, we went from 3% unemployment from the last time I talked to 11.3% unemployment. And I show here the unemployment rate in Colorado since 1992, just to show you the drastic quickness of the spike in unemployment once the coronavirus hit. You can see even during the Great Recession, say the Great Recession kicked off in September 2008 when some of those financial institutes started to fail and they were trying to bail out Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and American AIG. We didn't hit our top unemployment rate in the Great Recession till 2 years later, till September 2010. And it didn't get above 9% in the height of the Great Recession, the last recession here in Colorado. We went suddenly from 2.5% unemployment in 1 month to 2 months later, 11.3% unemployment. So just an amazing swiftness with which the economy just took a nosedive. And that has really hurt our revenue collections for the state. So about 2/3 of our state revenue from our general fund comes from income tax, and about the other third comes from sales tax. But when people don't have jobs, they don't pay income tax. And when they're don't have income, they're not buying things, they're not paying sales tax. So you can see the massive drop in revenue collections. I mean, normally these bars go the other way, where we have 10% growth in general fund collections year over year. We're going the exact opposite way. We're looking at a 7% drop in revenue from this year's budget and another 11% or so drop in next year's budget, which means we're looking at a $3.3 billion shortfall. That's a 25% shortfall. So when I say shortfall, it's basically, here's how much money we have for next year's budget. It's the budget that our legislators are currently working on. Here's what we spent last year's budget. Comparing just what we spent from last year's budget to this year's budget, we're $3.3 billion short of what we allocated last year. And so that even understates the damage of it because it doesn't take into account caseload growth and increase in population and inflation. So a massive, massive shortfall. To give you an idea of what the general fund was last year, about 36 cents of every tax dollar you give Colorado goes to schools. So schools are the biggest chunk of our overall state taxes. Medicaid or healthcare is about 26 cents, of every tax dollar. And then higher ed gets about 9 cents. Our prisons get about a little less than 9 cents. And human services get a little less than 9 cents. And then everything else from road funding to the courts to clean air and water, Department of Revenue, what we pay our legislators get about 12 cents. But think about the drasticness of a 25% cut. I mean, if you took 25% of this budget, that's basically, you could wipe out all of human services, all of corrections, and all of higher ed just to cover a 25% cut. Or it's mostly the whole entire Medicaid budget. So healthcare for low income and long-term healthcare for disabled and elderly populations in nursing homes. It's a massive, massive cut that our legislators are dealing with right now. And top that off, that's just a look at the state side of things. So Senator Bennett called us about 2 months ago and said they're trying to do fiscal stimulus for states. What's unique about Colorado that I need to start pushing at the federal level? And one of the things we showed them was we are heavily reliant on local sales tax. So we have the third highest rate of local sales tax. We're a tourist state. So when you pay sales tax, a portion of that sales tax is just the state sales tax, but most of it is the local city and county sales tax. So you look at the, sorry, my dog is.
That's okay.
A siren went off and now he's, Scott.
Go ahead, Chris, take a break and
Just 1 second.
that's okay. That's all right. Hey, that's the joy of being live on the internet. You never know what's going to happen.
Sorry.
You
All right.
sing us a song, Chris.
It's just police trucks. It doesn't, the pitch doesn't get her howling at police, fire trucks, just police cars.
Okay.
So back to so we're heavily relying on local sales tax. And if you look at tourist spending year over year from last year, it's down 80%. All these towns, the Urays, the Winter Parks, the Blackhawks, the Tellurides, they thrive on Memorial Day, July festivals, and all our tourism that pumps money into the economy to pay for their cities and counties. And what's really scary is this is all way, 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 way down. And so even when we look at a $3.3 billion shortfall for the state budget, the summation of all what the cities and counties and local governments are short on is about another $4 billion or so. So we're looking at a massive hit fiscally to our every size of government here in Colorado. And then I was able to give Senator Bennett a look at how much of our leisure, hospitality, food service, accommodation spending, and where it spikes in different months in different counties. And you can see like Mesa County really grows their leisure percentage of their revenue they collect from leisure and hospitality really spikes in spring and the summer. So there's a lot of big counties like the Mesa counties that really need to get the economy open or they're really going to be hurt. Mesa County has like a triple hit because oil and gas is tanked, tourist spending is down, and the state budget's going to cut a bunch of money from their schools. So we're in a bad way fiscally. Now, the federal government or the CARES Act, which is the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, did pump in a lot of money into the state. Kind of the three biggest provisions I talk about from the CARES Act was the stimulus, $1,200 per taxpayer checks that went to people that made around $75,000. And then you got $500 per dependent child. That pumped a fair amount, about $4.5 billion worth of spending into the Colorado economy. But if you look at overall household income compared to the stimulus dollars, it was only about 1.5% or so. It was not nearly a lifeline that's going to sustain the economy for the year. It was just a shot in the arm for a couple of weeks. The other part of that CARES Act was fiscal relief to states. So the CARES Act set aside $150 billion for state governments. And then we got a portion of that $150 billion based on our population Colorado's population as a share of the entire population. So we got about $2.2 billion for the state to use. Some of it goes to the big counties like Adams, Denver, El Paso, and then the state gets, we figured, about $1.7 billion that the state can keep. Now, the debate in the last several months was whether that can be used to backfill lost revenue or whether it has to be used to pay for strictly coronavirus-related spending. And that's kind of up to debate with the lawyers. It's like, okay, no one's paying taxes, so you're going to have to cut schools by $500 million. That sounds like it's coronavirus-related. So that's kind of the debate. It seems like the governor recently has interpreted that he can use that money to backfill the lost revenue we're seeing from the very, very stalled economy. So there's fiscal relief, there's the stimulus checks, and then another big portion of the CARES Act that really has impacted working Coloradans has been the top off from unemployment insurance. So when you pay into unemployment insurance, the state matches about 50 to 60%, depending on the formula, if you get laid off. So say you get 50% of what you were making, the federal stimulus package then adds $600 a week on top of that. So that's a pretty big shot in the arm economically for people who lost their jobs. Actually, a lot of people are making more by not working because an extra $600 a week is more than they were making. So add 50% plus their wages plus another $600 on top every week has really stabilized a lot of people's pocketbooks. And it's actually pretty progressive way to return money. Normally, stimulus comes in by cutting the income tax. And by cutting the income tax, it normally just when you make millions and millions of dollars, the difference between income tax cuts turn out to be a lot of money. Whereas this was actually a pretty progressive way to return money. We did some figures looking at what percentage of the money went back to the poorest 20% of Coloradans versus the next 20% versus the next 20%. And so it was really a $1,200 stimulus check to a minimum wage worker. That's almost 10% of what they make over the year. So pretty big shot in the arm for low and middle income Coloradans. People who are left out, if you are an I-10 filer, so you don't have a social security number, but you're maybe an undocumented immigrant that does file taxes legally through an individual tax identification number. Even if you did that, they did not get stimulus checks. No undocumented immigrants got stimulus checks, or workers who didn't file taxes. So there were people that fell through the cracks, but they're the ones that really didn't. They're either undocumented or didn't file taxes. Okay, so that's the kind of background of what was the quickest response from the federal government. I think you're going to see lasting impacts on our schools. If you look at the last recession, it really wasn't until 2 years after the recession started where we really started to make drastic cuts. In the teeth of the Great Recession, we took about $1 billion from our K-12 education system, but that really didn't happen until like 2012. About 3 years after the Great Recession really started. The swiftness with this one's hitting our state pockets is amazing. Normally you don't lay off state and local government workers until like 3 or 4 years into a recession because it finally catches up with tax collections. We've had such a sudden impact to our government and our state economy that we're going to see a lot of furloughs right away. Higher ed's furloughing people. City and County of Denver, schools are going to start furloughing people right away. And so if you look at the overall school budget, about 2/3 of the money for schools comes from the state. So that's the general fund pie we looked at earlier. But the other side of the coin for school funding is the local side of things. So about 1/3 of the money that goes to schools is from your local property taxes. So your property taxes on your homes or your businesses. Now this pie looks completely different depending on which district you're in. Aspen is about 75% locally funded because they have a lot of property wealth they can tax. But like Pueblo is the exact opposite. They only have about 25% of their schools come from local property taxes, and the state school finance formula then backfills 3/4 of Pueblo. But overall, I show this pie to illustrate how we fund schools, but also if something changes in how we collect local property taxes, it flows through and can impact the state budget because the conduit through which it impacts the state budget is the school finance formula. So if local contributions to schools fall because of property tax cuts, it impacts how much money that has to come from the general fund to pay for schools. And that's a lot of the story in finance in Colorado in the last 3 decades is that we have really low property taxes on housing property. And it makes the state kick in more to pay for schools from the general fund, which then squeezes out higher education, and it squeezes out road funding, and it squeezes out human services funding, and it squeezes out other things that the general fund pays for. And so the legislature was delayed. They were supposed to meet Friday and Saturday, and the House was supposed to debate the long bill. It's called the long bill because it's like a 1,000-page bill. It's the state budget, the bill that is the actual budget for next year that starts in July. There's only really 2 constitutionally requirements of the legislature. They have to pass a school finance formula, and they have to pass a budget. There's really the 2 things they have to do before their extended legislative session ends. And they just returned here Monday. So they were gone for like 2 months. So they're kind of scurrying around to try to figure out how do they make $3.3 billion worth of cuts. If you look at last recessions, most times we cut our transportation funding. So during boom years, we typically tend to give $400, $500 million to roads from our general fund. But during recessions, that quickly goes to zero. And so transportation funding is dependent mostly upon registration fees. when you register your car every year, and then also the gas tax. So when you put a gallon of gas in your car, of that $2 right now, 22 cents of it is the gas tax. So that's the primary funding source for roads. What's tough about road funding is the gas tax has been 22 cents since 1991. And so the cost of steel and concrete has doubled, but since it's a per gallon, it hasn't increased with the price of a gallon. It's still just it was 22 cents in 91 when gas was $1.25. It was 22 cents when gas was $4 a couple of years ago. That's kind of the issue in the transportation world, is the inability to raise the gas tax for inflation. And that has to come because the TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, which is a constitutional amendment, says you can't raise taxes without a vote of the people. And so to even raise the gas tax to peg it to inflation would require a vote of the people. And the gas tax polls really, really badly. So that's one thing. We'll cut a bunch of our transportation funding. A year and a half ago, we would probably be in position to have given a couple $100 million to roads. That's gone. I imagine they'll probably cut another $450 million from K-12. That's a killer. I mean, we're talking, we have 178 school districts in Colorado. 110 are on four-day weeks already. Most of these are the rural tiny districts. 110 of them are on 4-day. With this level of cuts, they're talking not only more schools go to 4-day to save money, but some of the 4-day ones go to 3-day. That seems nuts to me. Again, the amount we cut from schools compared to the last recession, we hit about $1.1 billion. This will probably put us close to that same $1.1 billion worth of cuts if we add another $450 million from education, which puts the governor in a really difficult position because he campaigned on full-day kindergarten. So he spent last year convincing legislature to do full-day kindergarten. That cost the state about $250 million. So we were required to do full-day kindergarten, and you can't charge tuition. So a lot of districts before last year were the Boulders of the world were charging $400 for a month for kindergarten. And Polis said, no, we'll have the state pay for full-day kindergarten. You can't charge parents anymore. So it was a huge boost to some of people who are paying $400 a month for K-12. So the state basically kicked in an extra $250 million to pay for full-day kindergarten. I don't know how you can continue to have full-day kindergarten and then cut $450 million more from the budget. It's going to be crazy. And then higher ed looks like it's going to be decimated. They're looking at cutting higher education by 58%. So that's taken $600 million from higher education. And so the craziness is, I mean, if you had to gamble on whether Mesa State, what's the one in Gunnison? Western State, whether Western State and whether Adams State and Alamosa and even Northern Colorado, with that drastic of cut, and with the amount of people that are probably saying, I'm going to take the fall off because I don't want to pay tuition to do online education. I think some of the Adams State and Western State are at serious risk of closing, which would just decimate Gunnison and it would decimate the economy in Alamosa. And so I've been saying this, if we don't get some massive federal stimulus to backfill some of this revenue, we're going to make ghost towns out of a lot more small cities in Colorado. The other one that might be of interest to this population is the homestead exemption. The homestead exemption is a property tax break for individuals who have lived in they're older than 65 and have lived in their home for more than 10 years. This ends up being on average about $600 savings in property tax for the people who qualify for the homestead exemption. It's paid from the state. So the state basically backfills the local governments for that loss in property taxes that the seniors don't pay that qualify. That'll wipe to zero. That's exactly what happened in the last recession. Is we had 3 or 4 years where legislature zeroed that out. So that saves $160 million, but puts it on the backs of of seniors in their homes, 600 million from higher ed, about $500 million from K-12, no money for roads. And we'll also probably tap into our reserve. So we do have not really a rainy day fund, it's called a general fund reserve. And it's at 7.25% right now. So we have about 7% of the general fund we set aside for an emergency. But 7% pales in comparison to a 25% reduction. So we'll dip in and cover some of that by dipping into our rainy day fund. But deep cuts are coming. And so not only that, so we had this huge hit from the COVID crisis. At the same time, the world supply of oil and the gas has almost went zero. A crude barrel of oil has just tanked. And that's really crushing Weld County and Mesa County, the big counties that heavily rely on their revenue for local governments from property tax from oil and gas and severance tax. And so there's another thing in our Constitution that I've talked about before. It's called the Gallagher Amendment. The Gallagher Amendment impacts how much money we can collect from property tax. And so Gallagher says you can only collect 45% of overall property tax has to come from homes, and then 55% comes from non-homes, the non-residential side. And so a little more detail on property tax to understand Gallagher. You don't pay property tax on the entire value of your home, just the assessed value. So when you do your property tax, you take your $350,000 home, you multiply it by the assessment rate to get your assessed value. And then your assessed value gets multiplied by your mills. That's the fancy word for your property tax rate. So you pay mills for your fire department, for your library district, for your maybe sewage district, for your city and county, and for your schools. Well, Gallagher said only 45% of overall property taxes can come from housing. And back in the early 80s, that assessment rate on homes was 21%. The assessment rate on all other property, that includes oil and gas, businesses, agricultural, was 29%. The problem is housing growth has greatly outpaced the value of other property in Colorado. And to keep the seesaw balanced, that we only collect 45% from property taxes from homes, the assessment rate had to continue to be cut and cut and cut and cut and cut. It fell to 7.96% in 2003. In 2017, it fell again to 7.2. Then it fell to 7.15. And so we've gone from 21% assessment rate on homes to about 7% assessment rate. So a third of the value of your home is actually subject to the mills, to the property taxes for your schools and your fire districts and your library districts and your counties. And so what that means is, if you look at the overall market value of property, it's 80% residential. But Gallagher says we got to squeeze 80% residential into only 45% of property taxes. And to do that, we keep on lowering the assessment rate. Well, this massive drop in oil value and business value is throwing off the Gallagher calculation. And so next year, we're going to cut that rate on homes from 7.15 to 5.88. That's an 18% drop in the rate. Now this, in Denver, Littleton, when the Front Range, when your house is going up by 20% just in value and the rate's cut by 18%, you'll still pay a little more in property taxes. So it doesn't nearly hurt Denver and the Front Range as much. It really hurts rural Colorado. So if you go to say so I have these fire district chiefs are calling me and saying, I need to explain Gallagher to people because we're here in Kremling and we don't have massive growth in residential property like y'all have in Denver. But the Gallagher Amendment's going to cut us by 20%. And so our 3 mills that people pay for their fire district in Kremling is now worth 20% less. I, as a fire chief, can't raise the mills without a vote of the people. And so I have to explain the Gallagher Amendment to people in Kremling to explain to them why we're cutting our EMT and we can't pay for our extra fire station. because the Gallagher, basically home growth in Denver, is really killing fire districts in rural Colorado. And that just suddenly has popped up in the last 2 weeks with the unbalanced growth in residential and non-residential. Is you're going to see a drastic cut in property taxes because of the Gallagher Amendment, which is going to really hurt. Again, it's going to exacerbate the school calculation, because we're going to collect $250 million less on homes, which means the state has to find $250 million to keep us where we're at. On the same time, we're making massive cuts to schools. So this is 2 years down the road, another like very, very devastating hit to budgets, local budgets and state budgets, because of the constitutional amendment, the Gallagher Amendment. Now, it has kept our property taxes super low. Latest rankings on our home property, if you have a $350,000 home in Colorado, you pay about $1,700 in property tax. That, as a portion of the value of your home, it's one of the lowest in the country, 48ths. So yeah, we have super low property taxes on homes, pretty high on non-residential property. But what that means is the state budget basically has to backfill your property tax cut by cutting roads or cutting higher education, cutting your human services budget. And so the last piece of the fiscal puzzle right now is what's getting on the 2020 ballot. 3 months ago, it was going to be, you're going to have to dodge people when you're coming out of the grocery store, because everyone was going to be with a petition trying to get your signature to get on the ballot. I thought 3 months ago we were going to see 20 things on the bottom of the ballot. We're a citizens initiative state, so we go to the vote of the people to pass things like the minimum wage or tax increases or abortion-related things. There's always the citizens initiative process running around trying to gather 130,000-ish signatures to qualify for the ballot, to see what Coloradans see on the bottom of the November ballot. One of the big ones, one campaign running around right now, like you've heard about the wolf introduction, asking voters whether they want to reintroduce wolves into northern Colorado. That has already made the ballot. But there's a lot of other ones that are trying to find the signatures in time to qualify. Now, no one's been collecting signatures in the last 2 months. What was interesting, the governor just recently ruled that they can expand the ability to collect signatures through mail and potentially email. That's a really interesting debate right now, whether that violates the Constitution. So that really is going to dictate in the next 2 months. We'll figure out what qualifies for the ballot. One of the big ones out there is an income tax. There's a group trying to raise the income tax again. That's Initiative 271. And that would raise the income tax for anyone making more than $250,000. So it would generate close to $2 billion, but all the money comes from the top 4%. So it really raises rates significantly on the top 4%. And actually cuts the rate for everyone else. So if that makes the ballot, we would see the income tax at 4.63%. It would lower to 4.58. So a very small cut for the bottom 95%. And then the rates would jump up to about, I think, 6 or 7% and then 8% in a graduated scale as a way to generate a lot more money for the state budget through the really high, wealthiest Coloradans. That is a very interesting one to watch to see if they actually make the ballot. There's some other ones that are looking to modify the way legislators can raise fees in this state. They're in the same boat. They're trying to collect signatures to get on the ballot. But I bet there's a dozen groups right now really hoping that they can collect signatures through the mail, because I don't know if they're going to be able to collect 130,000 signatures and get 2% in every Senate district when no one wants to interact with people. So that is another thing to keep your eye on the next 3 months. Cool. Those are my prepared stuff that I thought I would start with. I think we can open it to questions and we'll take the discussion however.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Everybody, you can unmute yourself, I believe. When you're ready to ask a question, just go to the lower left side of your screen and hit the mute button. You should be able to do that. Chris, you're talking about on the 2020 ballot for this November, right?
Yes.
That's all the things that are going to be on the ballot besides the presidential race for this November.
Yep, I always talk about the bottom of the ballot. Those are the issue stuff, the tax increases. And a lot of these are local too. So you vote. These are the 3 A's, and vote yes on 4 A's for your sheriff, or vote for this for your school, or vote for this for your. Yes.
Yeah. Can the legislature put on their own issues on the ballot and say, we're in a crisis now, we need to change the way we do things, or the Gallagher Amendment? Can they just put something on the November ballot?
Yes, they can. So it's easier to get on the ballot through the legislative process, but well, not maybe easier, but it doesn't require signatures, but it requires at least a 2/3 majority. And grabbing a 2/3 in the legislature right now would be very hard. But I don't know. I mean, the Gallagher Amendment's typically business owners hate the Gallagher Amendment because they're paying a lot higher property tax on their business property. Fire districts are getting crushed. That drop last year from 7.96 to 7.2 gutted a lot of fire districts. And then they went to their voters and tried to say, hey, the assessment rate from Gallagher fell. Can we just raise our mills to make us even? And even that's a hard push because no one understands the Gallagher Amendment. You get people like, let's say, Red, White, and Blue Fire District in Breckenridge called me and said, we just spent 2 years ago getting a mill levy increase, and we fought really hard to get it. The Gallagher Amendment has negated it. Now I got to go to voters and say, will you raise it again? And they're like, well, we just did. But they really didn't because Gallagher negated it. So fire chiefs are really struggling with the Gallagher Amendment. And this is probably going to be a bad fire season, judging by the snowpack and rain right now.
Yeah. Anybody else jump in now and ask Chris questions?
This is
Yeah,
Linda.
I have a question about the gasoline tax. The tax was levied for a particular purpose, for roads. And if the legislature just wipes that out, couldn't there be a class action suit against the state and forcing them to use the tax for the intended purpose for which it was levied?
Yeah, I think you saw, and that kind of dovetails into another discussion right now, is another way to kind of deal with the shortfall in the general fund is to kind of sweep some of those cash funds. That's what you saw actually in the Great Recession. And that's what they're already proposing, sweeping some of the marijuana. They'll definitely get sued. Someone will sue them. I think what they did under the last time was worked legally. Depends on, like, say for instance, with the marijuana money, we put it into our Constitution. So at least 40 million has to go to the one dedicated source for schools, but there's flexibility with the other part of the marijuana money. So I think legally they'll be able to sweep some of those to bridge some of the shortfall. But what's getting cut is like all the programs that legislators have fought for in the last several years, like to take that marijuana and do like anti-bullying stuff, and to do leadership programs for teachers, and to do school counselors. Yeah, I don't think you'll see them touch the gas tax, because to be honest, they need it for roads.
Thank you.
Chris, cutting this drastically in a single year, does that place us under permanent jeopardy given the Tabor base?
It's a great question, Linda. We kind of made a correction to the Tabor base with a referendum C back in 2005. So before, the initial Tabor cap used to grow from last year's collections. And so that was the downward ratchet effect that they fixed. So basically, if you had a recession, the cap then had to restart from a very lower valley. And so that was changed with referendum C. Now the cap grows by last year's cap. So the dip in revenue doesn't impact the cap. It still grows by inflation plus population. And so right now we're $1.5 billion below the cap right now. So there's no real Tabor rebate issue right now. Whereas last year we gave $450 million back from Tabor. The income tax that we paid was less when you did your taxes in April this year for 19, because we had to return 400 million or so. Now we're 1.5 billion below that cap, whereas last year we were 400 above it and we had to return that 400.
Will there be any effort to repeal Tabor on the ballot?
I don't think the polling ever gets there. The one group that's looking to go for a graduate income tax has spent 4 years working with partners trying to figure out what they could do to improve the school finance and road situation. And none of the public opinion polling gets them close to, I think, enough to try to take something out of the Constitution. And then that Prop CC, which we voted on last year, it was just a small modification to Tabor. It got smashed. So I just think, I think given the fact that voters have to vote on it, they're basically just going after the rich. I think that's probably statistically the best way to pass an election is to tax the heck out of the top 5%.
What about federal support? I know the states are all asking for more federal support.
Yeah, so just put in that context, the federal support was about 1.6 billion. So that some of that will plug the $3.3 billion shortfall. I think, to be honest, I think every legislature is praying that there's more that's directly federal relief for lost revenue. And I think a lot of towns are hoping that can support and backfill all the lost sales tax for the Urays and the Tellurides and the Winter Parks and the Montroses and the tourist towns in Colorado. That's their lifeblood. But
has anybody done any projections or prognostications about the impact upon nonprofits? I keep thinking about churches like our church. And immediately I look around the group that we're having right now, and most of us are sitting in a somewhat insulated and isolated circumstances. Just speaking for Pat and I, our income and our lifestyle hasn't changed even a little bit since this whole thing started. But the day of reckoning is undoubtedly coming, especially since the homestead exemption is going to go away next year, and since probably other things will come to impact us. And it would seem to me that people that are in similar circumstances throughout the economy are the people that usually support nonprofits and continue to write our checks for our church pledges and to make donations to other organizations. It would seem to me that churches and other nonprofits over the next 3 to 5 years are in grave jeopardy. But maybe there's some kind of a possibility that you know about.
No, I don't, because I work for a nonprofit, and I'm scared as y'all are. In addition to what you just mentioned, which is perfectly articulated, the stock market tanking, money from big foundations that also have that generate money from the stocks and stuff. So there's definitely correlation between when the stock market's doing really well and donations to nonprofits. And so that, on top of what you just said, is an additional hit. I think you're right in saying that we're going to see the world, and there's be a three-year lag before we really see some of the damages from the sudden impact.
Right.
Chris, is it likely or unlikely, do you think, that we will see another congressional stimulus of $1,200 per individual and more after that for states and little cities again too, or is it just too much money for even the federal government to spend?
That's an interesting question. So most, you teach this to econ students in 101, Keynesian economics. That was the big breakthrough into depression. When we hit a huge slowdown, there's a role for the government to be the spender, to jumpstart the economy, to get people spending. And my spending is then your income. And Steve, you take your income and then go out and spend it at Ron's shop. And then Ron has income, right? That's the idea of stimulus, is to jumpstart the economy. Some of the stimulus back in last recession was spent paying back debt. And so it wasn't very stimulating. And so that's why I keep on saying, like, the best thing you can do with your stimulus is to go out and, get your hair cut or buy some takeout to support a local restaurant. So you're injecting that money and getting the most kind of bang for your buck, because you're injecting the money into the economy. I think in an election year, it makes really good sense if you're a politician to send $1,200 to people again. I bet we'll see another one of those. Particularly if as states are opening up and there's a resurgence of the virus, and there's risk of having to reclose or slow down the opening up process. I think I'm betting on it, because I just bought a green egg smoker, because I've been staying at home smoking meat all day since I work from home now, and I feel like I've already mentally spent that money. But I think the biggest thing I'm worried about, I think they really need to have fiscal relief to cities and counties, at least from our perspective in Colorado. Because, I mean, you forget how much, if you look at the jobs, like if you look at the jobs in Pueblo, CSU Pueblo is a huge employer. The school district in Pueblo is a huge employer. People in that area tend to think, the government, iffy on government, but they don't realize how much of their economy is the state, is the schools and the community colleges and the hospitals that are paid through Medicaid. There's a huge ripple effect when you cut government budgets like that, just economically.
Ann, go ahead. You've got a question.
Where do we rank out of the 50 states in property taxes? The map helped, and I knew our taxes were low compared to other states, but do you know the number compared to the other states where we are?
If you look at residential, so what portion of the value of your home compared to taxes, we're 48th. So 2 states have lower property taxes on homes. But then if you look at our ranking for like business property, we're probably right in the middle, or even maybe a little higher than the average.
We should really publicize that more, because as a retired school teacher, I always heard, when we talked about the budget and property taxes, oh, how high our property taxes are. And I don't think Coloradans realize how low. 48 out of 50? That's ridiculously low. We should be paying much higher property taxes.
I think you see a lot,
because what you get.
People, particularly in the last 5 years in the metro area, they've been blessed with the value of their home is like doubled. And so of course the property tax are doubled, but they forget that they're blessed with an asset that just went up $300,000. Mm-hmm. And yet when you're paying a mortgage like me, I don't even see that, because it comes out of my escrow account. But people who have already paid out their mortgage and have to write a check to the assessor, suddenly wrote a check for $4,000 instead of $2,000. That's a big hit into someone's budget. But as a portion of, like, since their home's worth now $700,000, as a portion of the value of their home, it's a very small compared to other states. So I can feel for the people that think they have super high property taxes, because they also have to realize the asset they own is now worth a lot.
Mm-hmm.
We've got about 10 minutes left, but we've always got questions. Go ahead, folks. You got questions, you just haven't asked them yet.
Chris, I was going to ask you about the stimulus packages that are being passed. And I haven't heard any economists talk about the possibility of hyperinflation from printing enough money that would make most people's eyes water. We seem like we're doing it very casually. And hyperinflation is one of the great evils to governments, that it can bring down governments and change the way people even think about things. And yet there doesn't seem to be any attitude, and I don't hear this in any of the commentaries or any of the things that I read in the Denver Post or anything like that. Could you talk about that, about hyperinflation from printing too much money?
Yeah, so think about two different things in fiscal policy. There's stimulus, which is how much money we actually spend as a government, and that goes into our deficit or our national debt. And so as we spend trillions of dollars for the stimulus, we've added a lot more to our deficit. And then on the Federal Reserve side, we've cut interest rates. We did a bunch of things similar to quantitative easing, which basically injects liquidity into the market, both of which should start inflation. And you're right, back in the 80s when we had a very problem in the late 70s and 80s, and we had a problem and had 12% inflation. Right now, however, we're fighting deflation because everyone's getting fired, no one's spending money. And so a lot of the macroeconomists right now would actually like higher inflation. Higher inflation is good in the sense that if you're a borrower, you basically get to pay back your loan with cheaper money. If you borrow money, you like inflation because you're paying back that dollar is now cheaper to you in the future. So some level of inflation, 2 or 3%, always, we say, lubricates the economy because it helps out farmers and borrowers. Right now, the world is such in a panic that we're basically the biggest person at the casino and we're the safest person at the casino. So even though our national debt and our deficit are like getting close to like World War II. So when we look at national debt, we look at our deficit as a percentage of the economy. And if you chart that since like the World War II, we're getting close to that level in a yearly deficit. But we're not seeing inflation. If you look at our T-bills, basically how we borrow money, we're such a safe resource right now. And people are still spooked with stocks and stuff that people are still flooding to the US because we're a safe haven. So there's a ton of liquidity out there and it's all flooding to the US because we're the biggest person at the casino and we're the safest bet. And so typically we would normally worry about inflation, but right now it's non-existent. So until you see T-bills, our interest rates on how we borrow start ticking up, then they're historically low right now.
So here's a question. So do you think that this whole coronavirus crisis is going to accelerate purchasing online? Are people going to buy their next car online? Are people going to, instead of go to Macy's, you're going to buy it online?
Well, I bet. I think you see Amazon just grabbing more and more of the market. Amazon before this had 54% of online purchasing. I bet they're just eating more and more competitors. Again, I think it's that same ghost town effect that I'm worried about, is that it's going to crush small businesses even further.
Chris, let me ask you a question that's kind of out there. The movies sometimes show a crisis and the world economic collapse, and then the zombies are running around. What's the likelihood that other countries' economies could actually collapse and that could domino, and could it actually happen to America and to the world?
Ooh, a zombie apocalypse? That's basically
right. Starting with the economies collapsing.
I think that what this has highlighted is the interconnectiveness and the supply chain issues that we have. Yeah. Even with stock masks, if all our masks and ventilators came from China, I think you're going to see, in at least initial responses, to kind of pull away and be a little bit more isolationist. Mm-hmm. Whether that's good, I think that will probably mean your stuff that you buy at Walmart and Target is going to become more expensive because you're not taking the benefit of the cheap production and manufacturing and other. So it's a trade-off. Any isolationist policy, you're going to support your local, your hometown manufacturers at the benefit or the detriment of your consumers. I think you might see a little bit more of that. I think we'll see at least a lot more stockpiling of medical supplies now, if we don't see like a federal like warehouse in Kansas that just stocks ventilators and zombie masks.
5 more minutes left, folks.
Chris, what is the likelihood that the feds will give us money to backfill higher ed?
So the stimulus, it was our American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2009 and 10. If you look at higher education funding, basically the entire state share of higher ed was paid for 2 years from the federal relief. I can't imagine they won't do that again, given the other stuff that we're not at risk of inflation right now, and we can borrow for so cheap that it seems to be a good time to borrow and backfill higher ed and schools through fiscal relief. So again, that's what I think is, if the economy opens up, even if it opens up suddenly and we have a cure, I would say the best bang for the buck for the federal fiscal policy would be to backfill the states and counties and school districts so they don't fire all those workers.
Thank you.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I heard you say that this fiscal pain is going to last for a couple of years. What's your best guess about when we might see the economy start to improve, and how does that compare with the 2008 recession?
Yeah, great question. If you look at unemployment rates, like we didn't get back to like pre-2008 unemployment until like 2014 or so. Let me pull it up just 1 second. Let's see. If you look at the unemployment rate, let's see here. The unemployment rate, I mean, we didn't get back to pre-Great Recession unemployment until late 15. So it takes a long time to, once you fire workers, to restart the economy and spending to start again. I'd imagine it would be several years, even if the economy opens up right now and we have an antidote or a vaccine. There's so much uncertainty. People are paying back debt. I think you'll see a lot of just people go to more skeleton crew. So I would say several years before we're back under kind of in the 4 to 5% unemployment rate.
Thank you.
I had a question. It's all scary, but the education issue is a big concern of mine. And have they indicated that it's less expensive to stay with the remote learning than open up the schools again?
I think it's less expensive. I think it's the same philosophy of why a lot of districts went to 4 days.
Yeah.
But again, there's a lot of, it's talking to some superintendents. The issue wasn't having laptops for students as much it was having broadband that's reliable for students. So you have like a lot of these people like in Creede, Colorado, they're going to the parking lot at the school trying to get their Wi-Fi because the Wi-Fi is not good enough in parts of rural Colorado to even access your live Zoom link to your 3rd grade teacher because it's a broadband issue. I think that's even a bigger issue that's one of the issues that needs to be addressed. And that's even good for business. We've been telling people investments in broadband for rural Colorado is good for everybody. I wonder if this doesn't jumpstart that. Again, it's hard to jumpstart when you're making massive cuts, but certainly sheds light on that policy. I think another thing this really has shed light on is the need for paid leave or paid sick days, like some states have done, requiring every job to have at least 2 or 3 paid sick days. So people just who are squeezed budgets don't come in and make your Subway sandwich with a cold. I bet you'll see big pushes to family and medical leave and paid leave, paid sick time.
It's 11:30. We need to start wrapping up. Any final questions for Chris? Ann, go ahead.
I was a preschool and kindergarten teacher for kids with significant disabilities. So I have the luxury of having all-day kindergarten. And, you know, I was really excited when Polis said about all-day kindergarten, but I realized, how can it even be maintained over the years, even without the virus? I was wondering, where is this money coming from? And did anybody bring that up last year when things were looking good economically? Yeah, it's great to have all-day kindergarten for everybody, but how do you finance it? Now they've created all these classrooms with all these materials, hired all these teachers, and guess what? They can't maintain it.
Yeah.
Correct. It's very difficult time to be a CFO at a school right now, trying to figure out and guess what they have to write their next year's budget this month, and they're just guessing what massive cuts will come from the state budget.
Even in good years, it would be very, very difficult to maintain it. And did anybody bring that up? No, you know, I've been in education for close to 40 years. I taught in public schools, you know, and realized when that came up last year, yeah, everybody jumped on the bandwagon and it sounded great, but there is no way. And to hire all those teachers and then to say bye-bye.
I think Polis did a very good political move by making it sound a lot better than it was. But just to give you some context, it was like $250 million, but $100 million of that was then tuition that parents were paying. So it didn't actually net some school districts more money. Some districts actually lost money because the state gave them more, but then they couldn't charge the parents. And so the bang for your buck, for as far as if you, as a CFO trying to pay for teachers, it really wasn't that helpful. And then now you have to pay for full day kindergarten. Correct. But to your point, Ann, we made $1 billion of cuts to schools in the last recession, and that's $1 billion shortfall every year. And so we slowly tried to make that 800 million instead of $1 billion, and then we made it 700 million, and then we finally got it down to about 570 million. So basically, we're still 570 million last year below where we should be spending on schools if we kept up with inflation. So that's that annual shortfall. If you really follow school finance, it's called the negative factor. But even in the boom times when we have unemployment at historic levels, low levels last year, we still couldn't backfill the cuts we made during the last recession. And now we're smashing those cuts right back on schools, going right back up to $1 billion shortfall for schools. I mean, this might change some votes. I think people that might vote against the tax increase might finally say, instead of putting during a recession, instead of putting on the backs of kindergartners and low income and people who rely on government services, let's ask the wealthy to put in a little more, kind of take a little bit from, give them a little, spread the pain around a little bit, I guess.
Thanks.
Good question. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Chris, for a great presentation and taking your time this morning.
Yeah, that's fun. I always like it.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris.
You're a great presenter. We appreciate your time.
Yeah, let me know if you have one similar presentation in like late October, if you want to run down on what's on the ballot, what actually gets there on the ballot.
Good. Okay.
Good.
Great. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, Chris.
You're welcome.